everybody. Welcome once again to
Yes, sir.
Brothers. I am Nathan.
And I am Keith. So, Nathan, before we started this episode, I was up with Alice. She decided to watch the fourth season with her mom of Chosen.
Yeah.
And we have come to the conclusion that I finally have Peter's arms. So if you watch Peter in the
Peter's
episode,
arms?
yeah,
I
yeah,
see. Like
guys got
size,
some nice
shape
guns.
wise.
Yeah, I've
Okay.
finally reached
Praise
that
God.
point. I'm much more pale, but the shape is
Right.
there.
That's
Uh,
awesome.
and then Alice looks at me and she says, "Okay, now get Peter's hair." And I said, "Not happening. I have Paul's hair, just like I have Paul's attitude in life."
But you can have Peter's beard.
There you go.
So that works too.
And since I have Paul's hairdo and attitude, on occasion, I will certainly burn a village or two and tell people just to go ahead and cut their penises off and move forward.
Right.
So I was
Yes.
doing that the other day, as is
Okay.
I have occasion to do, have been known to do.
Keith
and
means proverbially for our listeners. Just those of you who take the Bible literally. He's just that's a metaphor.
Yes.
Anyway, go ahead.
I'm not a pyromaniac in real
Right.
life. I just play
He's
one
not
on the
actually
internet.
chopping penises off either. Just so everyone's clear.
That's true. Oh man! And as I was village burning on some posts, I ran across this, which I think is the perfect intro to what we're going to talk about today. Are you ready?
Okay. Yeah.
I can't wait for your reaction to this one. First of all, it starts with emojis, which you know right off the bat is going to be good. And the emojis are a bunny's head, an egg, the Bible, another egg, and a bunny's head. So it's the Bible framed within bunnies and eggs.
Okay. Gotcha.
And then it's got three of the thinking emojis, with the finger on the chin and looking upward, like consider this.
Yeah, like the monkey.
Exactly.
Anyway.
As I look at it, I'm kind of disappointed. There are no fire emojis, so I don't know how seriously I can take this.
Well, yeah. I mean, without a fire emoji, it's suspect right off the bat.
A little sus. And then after all of the emoji introductions, here's what we see. Do you know who Easter is? She is a fertility goddess. Eostre, Easter, is linked to eggs and hairs. Did you know that God already set aside a day to remember the resurrection of Jesus? It's called the Feast of First Fruits, and it's a prophetic feast that you can read about in Leviticus 23. Heart emoji. You can see that Paul calls Jesus the first fruits in 1 Corinthians 15:20. Then it quotes that. And after you read Exodus 23:13, God tells us to make no mention of the name of other gods, nor let it be heard from your mouth. God would never want the name of a pagan fertility goddess on our lips while referring to the resurrection of his son. Then it goes on. And it talks about how God's feasts are beautiful. Remember that God says to his people to get out of Babylon, lest you share in her sins in Revelation 18. Since we know that the physical Babylon, Iraq, doesn't exist, it's the spiritual Babylon practices like Christmas, Easter, and Sunday worship that were being called out by God. Growing up, I had been taught that Christmas was Jesus' birthday celebration. However, long before Jesus was born, December 25th was a pagan holiday, originally celebrated by the ancient Romans as the rebirth of the sun god Sol Invictus. After learning that we are not to worship our God in the same way pagan gods are or were worshipped, I will not be celebrating Christmas anymore. Please read Deuteronomy 12 to read God's words. Constantine, I love it when people start throwing some history in. Constantine in 321 AD, a sun worshiper, told people to keep Sunday worship instead of God's everlasting commandment to keep his holy Sabbath on the seventh day. Let's turn back to God's specific ways. He asked us to worship him. If we love him, we will keep his commandments.
Right.
So, Nathan.
Yes.
I think this begs the question. Are we all going to hell for celebrating Easter?
I mean, I don't know. Those arguments were so ironclad that I don't even know if I have a response. I think I might just have to say, I can't do Easter anymore, Keith, or Christmas, I guess, because those were just airtight.
Yeah,
I think it was the bunny emojis that got me.
It was. I'm grateful they didn't put Thanksgiving.
Yeah, what about the 4th of July?
Yeah.
Isn't that about like Julius Caesar? We're like worshiping Julius Caesar on the 4th of July. So we need to stop
worshiping
right?
Ben
That was
Franklin.
happening.
That was it.
And it's on the 4th. You know, the 4th day was a day of pagan, orgies and all this other kind of stuff on the 4th day. So that's really what it's all about. It's actually not about America's Independence Day. It's about Julius Caesar having orgies.
It must have been.
Have you ever heard this before?
No.
No, I'm not making this up. I'm being serious.
We can spread this on the internet. Are you serious? I thought you're pulling my leg.
No, I'm being dead serious.
Oh, my gracious.
Yes.
Dude,
So,
I don't know why I'm surprised at any moment where more nonsense is shared.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. Like you really never heard, well, I shouldn't say never, but you rarely heard these kinds of arguments prior to the internet. There was, I guess there wasn't as much platform for idiocy and like totally untrained people to share their thoughts on subjects.
Mm-hmm. Internet experts.
So we just
there are a lot of internet experts.
Right. And okay, do you want to start with that, everything that person just said? Or do you want to get, is that where we want to go?
Well, that person started with Easter. Certainly. So, we could start directly with that Easter claim, or we could just start with, holidays in general, however you want to take it.
I think probably let's just start with the Easter specifically, since Easter's coming up real quick, and I imagine we'll have this out before then, probably, right? So
good.
So
and
maybe
there are
let's
plenty
just do the
shopping
Easter
days left until Christmas, but Easter's close, so we got to figure that one out quick.
So, by the way, just so everyone knows, these kinds of arguments were actually started. Maybe I should say started, but definitely propagated by pagans themselves. So, like the neo-pagans, atheists, these were the ones who really got the ball rolling. And then, of course, religious Christians picked that up because, as we know, the spirit of religion lives to suck the joy and love out of every single human experience and call it holiness. And so anytime there's an opportunity to imprison people, to strip them of freedom, and to make them feel guilt and shame for anything, the religious spirit is going to jump on that opportunity and try and strip all joy and love out of the universe and call it following Jesus.
So what you're saying is, out of the 7 dwarfs, religion would think Grumpy was the most holy.
Yes, absolutely. And if there was a sucky dwarf, then
well, there's certainly plenty of dopey posts. So
right. So let's start with, I think, first of all, people need to understand a couple of things. Like, I was a history minor, which doesn't make me an expert on history, of course, and just because I even even a degree does not necessarily mean you're an expert. However, I think I understand the study of history probably better than your average Joe. So, in order to make the claims that this person makes, you need to have some primary sources. And do all of our listeners know the difference between a primary source, a secondary source, a tertiary source? Do you think people know what those are?
I would highly doubt it.
Probably not. Okay. So, um, just so everyone, when you're studying history and you really want to find something out, if you're going to make a bold claim, like the claims made in this post, you need to have, and you're going to make a bold historical claim, then you need to be able to show what we call a primary source. So, in other words, how should I put this? So, okay, let's say during the Revolutionary War, we have a letter from George Washington himself that we know was written by George Washington, that was attested by numerous witnesses, that everything we call internal consistency and external consistency of this letter, which we don't need to go into how we establish the validity of a historical text, but those are two of the main ways that you go about it. And we know this is a letter written by George Washington.
Mm-hmm.
And let's say George Washington says, "My mom was a meanie head," or something like that. We know George Washington's mom was not awesome. She lied a lot. She was quite greedy, and I think probably was a result of her husband dying. If you don't know this about George Washington, her husband died when George was young, leaving her with 5 kids and not a lot of money. So she was scared about that. And as George Washington was going up in his career and trying to fight a war, she would complain publicly about how he didn't give her money and that she was always poor. She even went to the state of Virginia seeking money as like, someone that would need to be on welfare today, for instance. He even, George Washington, when he went to give her money, actually went with people so they'd have witnesses so they could see that in fact he bought his mom a house and was providing for her. So he writes all of this in a letter, right? So we know this to be the case. That letter would be a primary source, mm-hmm. right? It comes right from the horse's mouth. Now, if that letter was quoted, or not even quoted, if somebody else is talking about that letter in a different historical document, that would be a secondary source, right? So in other words, we're trying to trust this guy's word about what he said about something else.
Which would happen primarily in things like papers, biographies, where the authors reference works like that, and so on.
Right. So
they'll cite it accordingly. Yeah.
Correct. So any respected historical document must have primary sources as their Now, they may use secondary sources to back up whatever the claim is they're making, but you have to have a primary source to back up whatever claims that you're making. You start from primary sources, and then you can work your way to secondary sources or tertiary sources, right? Like somebody quoting, mm-hmm. It becomes almost like telephone. So just so everybody knows, virtually all the claims that were just made are outright false, or there is no primary source to back them up, or it's scant. And we can talk about the actual evidence itself if you want to, unless you have something that you want to add to that. So if you want to go. Okay, so this whole idea of Eostre being this German goddess of like fertility and sex and stuff like that. Okay, so because a name sounds like a later name doesn't mean it came from that name. In other words, what they're doing is they're saying, well, Easter came from Eostre. Well, how do you know that? Do you have a document to prove that? Can you show that that's the case? Can you show a connection between an ancient goddess and the name Easter? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So there is no connection between that goddess and the word Easter in any primary source at all. That's just not there.
Now, hold on, Nathan.
Yeah.
I got to stop you. So what you're telling me is Wikipedia is not a solid source.
Well, I would say Wikipedia is a solid source if they're actually using primary sources. This is what I'm telling you.
I just want to make sure that we're clear on all of this. If you post something and then I repost it and give
Yes.
credit, because when I repost it, right, it shows who I post that from, that is not a valid secondary source?
No.
Okay.
No, it's not. Especially when you're talking about ancient history. When you're talking about ancient history, documents are very few and far between, with the exception of the Bible. So if our listeners don't understand this, there is about 4,000 times more documents to prove that Jesus not only existed, but died and resurrected and lived the life that he did, that we have that Julius Caesar even existed at all.
Or Alexander the Great. I did know that as well.
Or Alexander the Great, or anybody in the ancient
Mm-hmm.
Near East at all. In fact, I don't know, people just don't really understand this. Like most of the things we know about Greek history, for instance, are documents that we have that date to like 1400 AD, right? We're talking like 2,000 years after the fact. And maybe we have 4 or 5 copies of them. Now, maybe you have copies that are, I'm not getting these numbers exact, just so everyone knows, these are approximate numbers. I don't have them sitting in front of me. I'm just doing this from memory.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe we have documents that are 600-700 AD about Alexander the Great, that maybe we have one of those or two of those maybe. And so people ask, well, why does that matter? Well, it matters because you're talking about a document that's recording things that was 800 years before, and we only have 2 copies of it. So when we're comparing those 2 copies, we're not able to really tell truth. If you had 400 copies of the same thing, you can tell truth by discrepancy.
You increase
Does that
the
make sense what I'm saying?
validity of it.
Correct. Whereas we literally have over 5,000 documents about the life of Jesus, or the Bible, around when the Bible was written, some dating back to 60 AD, 70 AD. I mean, like
Within 30
within 10 to
years.
20 years,
Yeah.
sometimes 30 years of the actual events themselves. And when we have like 1,000 copies of that same thing, we're able to do what's called internal consistency. So you read all the documents, you set them side by side, and you're able to look and say, these are all exactly the same, or here's where the discrepancy lies. So we know that that document's probably false because it's different than the other 500 that we have. So anyways, we have thousands of documents that back up the life of Jesus, not many in others. So when you're talking about making claims of Babylonian whatever, the documents are scant at best when you're trying to make claims about where words came from. Because Eos today sounds like Easter, you're making an assumption that this is where it came from. Well, it did it? I don't know. We don't have any evidence to that to say that it did or it didn't.
Well, it depends on whether you want to consider the Facebook post evidence or a credible source. And
so I went to the
that's
actual
case.
source.
Well, let's look at it.
Right. So I went to the primary source, which is what you're supposed to do when you're trying to find out a historical claim is true or false. Eostre is a name we know very, very little about. We have one quote, Keith, one quote that includes this word from a very obscure monk by the name of Saint Bede. Okay, so I went to his document and I pulled it word for word. Okay, you ready?
Yep.
Here's what we have. Eos Sturmanath has a name which is now translated Pascal month. Now, Pascha, if you don't know, is Greek for Passover. So we'll get into where Easter celebration actually came from, at least that we know, we actually have documents to prove, or at least have some evidence for, and which was once called after a goddess of theirs named Eostre, in whose honor feasts were celebrated in that month. Now they designate the Paschal season by her name, calling the joys of the new rite by the time-honored name of the old observance. Okay, that is all we have. That is the only quote of anything close to Eos today, that we have in any ancient any document of any kind dating up from any time period. But the problem is we had this one quote from an obscure monk named Saint Bede, but we have no evidence at all anywhere that anybody was worshipped, that any goddess of Eostre was ever worshipped by that name.
So what you have to ask yourself as a historian, or anybody just reading this, would be, how does this guy in the 8th century, how does he know that?
How does he know that? Exactly. And we have absolutely no evidence that anybody named Eostre even existed or was worshipped by anyone from anywhere. So how he's coming up with this 800 years after the fact, I don't know. But it's obscure, weird thing that is not historical evidence. That's one quote from one guy 800 years after the fact.
So in the best case scenario, it's revisionist history because there's no evidence to support it.
Exactly. Probably, just so everyone knows, what we do have evidence to support is that I can't remember how it's pronounced in German. So there's a German word that sounds a lot like Eostre, which means like, I think it's the German word for April or something. So when Germans came over, and the Germans kind of brought the tradition of eggs and bunnies and things like that, and like, hiding eggs for kids and making this whole fun thing out of it. Probably the word where we get our word Easter is actually the German word for April, or I'm going to get that wrong, but that's probably where the word Easter comes from, not Eostre, none of that stuff. Like, this is all invented, and it's very recently invented that people ever thought or believed these things.
Okay.
So yeah, the idea of that is that, again, that's all we have. I mean, that's it. What I just quoted to you is all we have for someone to make that entire argument. So I would never, as a historian, I would never argue something like that, because that is not evidence. That's one quote from one guy 800 years later, of which we have no evidence to support. So if he made this quote and we had a ton of evidence from the time of a goddess named Eostre being worshipped by anybody, then maybe there'd be some credence to it. It still wouldn't prove the point, but at least we have something.
Yeah.
Like this is not that. This is like a complete lack of evidence to make a very bold statement. And then they also tie it to Ishtar. They're like, well, Eostre sounds like Ishtar. Now, Ishtar was an Assyrian and a Babylonian goddess of fertility and sex. That is true. So Ishtar was an actual goddess. We know for sure, have many documents that attest to this, that was an Assyrian and Babylonian god of fertility. That's true. But what the heck does Ishtar have to do with Easter? They're like, well, it sounds like it. It sounds like it. This is literally what's the point. They're trying to say that Eostre comes from Ishtar. Well, where are you getting that from? Like, how is that you're just making that up?
That's a little bit beyond linguistic gymnastics.
Oh yeah, you're just saying it sounds the same, so it's the same goddess. No, it's not. It's a different name. And they're saying, well, this is where we get our word Easter from. It's like, well, that's just not true. It's just not true. There's no evidence to support that at all.
Good grief.
So what were some of the other claims? I can't even remember now. I think I put them in like the category in my brain of such dumb things. I don't want them to take up space of the stuff that is smart. So
I mean, I'm trying to process the whole thing. It's almost like, once again, we've reached the point where we can just say, never let context or truth get in the way of believing whatever in the heck you want to believe. I mean, that's kind of where we've reached, period.
Yes.
So, all right. So let me go back here. So there's the case made that, hold on a minute, God's already set aside a day to remember the resurrection of Jesus. It's called the Feast of First Fruits, and then it goes along that.
Oh yeah. Do you want to just
Yeah,
talk
let's
about
do
that
it.
for a second?
Go for it.
Okay, so um, that is not without merit. In other words, there is something called. Do you know what the Feast of First Fruits is? Like in the
Uh,
Old Testament.
no, I don't.
Okay,
It's
so
one of the feasts. I know that
there's
much.
yeah, yeah. So there's 7 feasts that are outlined in under the law, right? That
Mm-hmm.
the Jewish people were to commemorate yearly. And so once a year there was a feast called the Feast of First Fruits, and that's in Leviticus 23. It talks about what you're supposed to do. So what they're doing is they take one sheaf of grain, right, and they bring it to the priest. Like everyone's supposed to do this,
Mm-hmm.
and then they kind of wave it around, and they wave it around by the idea is to thank God for the grain of the first harvest. So this was always celebrated the day after Passover. Passover again is the Greek word Pascha. So Passover was always on a Saturday and also celebrated once a year. And the very next day would be Sunday. Uh, and that would always be the Feast of First Fruits would be celebrated. So am I explaining this
Yes.
well? Okay, so that's what that was. Now, some people think, and it's maybe true as well, 1 Corinthians 15:20, which I think she also mentioned, or whoever it was, says this, but Christ has indeed been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. And they're meaning who have died.
Mm-hmm.
So he's saying Leviticus 23, uh, some people, and that might be true, that Paul's actually tying, he was the first fruits because the thought was in the time that Jesus, Friday is called what before Easter? Do you remember?
Good Friday.
Good Friday. This is the day, which is kind of ironic because this is the day Jesus dies, right? And then 3 days later would be Sunday
Mm-hmm.
on the Feast of First Fruits. Now, what's really cool about this is Jesus, of course, being a Jew and understanding the feast, knew and actually did die on Passover, or I'm sorry, on the weekend of Passover,
Mm-hmm.
and then was raised on the day of first fruits, which would be Sunday, which is the point Paul's probably trying to make here.
Yeah.
Okay, so, but what the heck does that have to do with anything, you know, other than there was a feast of first fruit? Well, I can tell you what it had to do. Now, this does have a lot of history to back up, is that Christians began to celebrate the resurrection of Christ after the Passover on Sunday every year, way before Constantine or the Catholic Church or anything like that.
Which this
There was
person is very upset about, by the way, in that same
about the
post.
Catholic Church or
Well,
what?
no, about celebrating on Sunday. Sunday worship apparently is also
Right.
sending you to hell.
Which, by the way, what you're going to find over and over and over again, whether it's Christmas or Easter, is there is a group who argues that you have to and can only worship Jesus on Saturday, or at least gather to worship Jesus on Saturday. If you worship him any other day as a gathering, you are in sin, and Saturday is the day. You know who that group is?
Seventh day Adventists?
Seventh day Adventist. That is correct. And what you're going to find is almost all these people who aren't neo pagans or atheists arguing for all of these holidays being pagan in origin. They're going to be Seventh day Adventists.
Interesting.
Yeah, who are going to sew right into it the same idea. Also, because the Seventh day Adventists, historically speaking, I'm not speaking to every Seventh day Adventist. I'm just saying, historically speaking, Seventh day Adventists have been very antagonistic towards the Catholic Church. So they don't like anything about the Catholic Church. In fact, the Catholic Church is the beast of Revelation. And the Antichrist is the papacy, which, by the way, was a very common view of the reformers and lots of people throughout church history. We don't have time to go there, but all I'm saying is like the Seventh Day Adventist Church historically has always been antagonistic towards the Catholic Church, and that kind of manifests sometimes through attacking anything the Catholic Church would do, which they would attribute Easter to Constantine, and so therefore that must be bad.
Interesting. I never knew that.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. I've listened to Seventh Day Adventists go, like, teachers just go off about this kind of stuff.
But that alone doesn't make sense to me, because if you serve a Sabbath God, then technically every day is a worship day.
Well, because you're the temple. So you are a living, breathing vessel of the worship of God.
In every moment.
In every moment, right? So whether you gather once a week or 10 times a week or once every 2 weeks, it's just important that you gather together in community as believers and encourage one another and love Jesus together. That's important. How often or what day? I mean, it's just going to depend on, no, yeah, it's just going to depend on whatever God's calling you to do or whatever you want to do. I mean, never having community would be unwise, of course. And Hebrews talks to us about that. But I mean, if you want to gather every single day, that's what they did in the early church. They gathered almost every day in houses to seek the Lord. It's like, nope, you can't. It's got to be Saturday. It's like, okay. Grief. But that's why she's arguing, I guarantee, for a Saturday, whatever, resurrection.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, not necessarily resurrection, but certainly just a worship day. And I guess the fact that he rose on Sunday apparently is, not a big deal.
Well, some of them will try and argue that Jesus was crucified on Wednesday and risen on Saturday or something like that. I read an argument like that one time.
Wait a minute. So what you're telling me is that somebody has made an argument that completely twists logic, facts, the meaning of words to fit their ideology?
That's what I'm saying. Yes.
Inconceivable. I can't believe that actually happened.
But honestly, sometimes, I know, right? But sometimes I honestly think okay, so they're making different historical claims that are clearly false, or at least have no evidence to support them at all. And others are just easy to dismiss. But is there anything else we want to talk about as far as the claims being made?
No, not as far as that.
Okay, so really, because to me, the more important question is, like, even if all those things were true, so let's just give her that all of that's true. Let's just give her, or whoever it is, like that is true, that this Easter was Aostre and was the worship of Ishtar and all this other stuff. My then follow-up question would be, why is that relevant? What in the world does that have to do with people gathering as believers and loving Jesus and in a special way recognizing the resurrection and the crucifixion in a celebratory way? And what relevance does that have?
Yeah, I think that's the best question you could ask. Yeah. Because, I mean, if you think about it, there's always something. I mean, there's evil people are going to do evil things no matter what day it is.
Yes.
Why should that influence what we do and how we celebrate? And if we're really going to go to that extreme, look at the calendar now. I mean, it's National Women's Month, right? It's probably National Donut Day tomorrow. Like, there's always some kind of
right.
Every day's got like some kind of national day of something.
Yeah, seems like it nowadays.
Yeah. So, okay, well, let's say that donuts are evil, which is debatable.
Well, I think they might be, actually, but yeah. Especially the maple bars that are like filled with vanilla cream. Oh my gosh.
And bacon.
Straight out of Satan, I'm telling you.
So let's say that is. I mean, then, suddenly you can't worship that day. Suddenly you can't go, I'm reclaiming this day for Jesus.
Well, let's before we get into that, do you want to read, because almost all of them are going to do the Deuteronomy 12 thing, which I think she also brought up. I told you it's probably their favorite scripture.
Let's
So
do it.
Deuteronomy 12:29 says this: When the Lord your God cuts off before you the nations which you are going in to dispossess, and you dispossess them and dwell in their land. So first of all, let's just understand context, which I know is crazy, but let's just understand context here. That obviously God is addressing Israelites who are about to take over the promised land, which requires kicking people out who are currently there,
Mm-hmm.
or killing them all, depending on the people we're talking about. Okay, so he says, beware that you are not ensnared to follow them after they are destroyed before you, and that you do not inquire after their gods, saying, how do these nations serve their gods, that I might do likewise? Okay, so, well, let's read the rest of it. You shall not behave thus toward the Lord your God, for every abominable act which the Lord hates, they have done for their gods. For they even burn their sons and daughters in the fire to their gods. Whatever I command you, you shall be careful to do. You shall not add or take away from it. Okay. So what they'll do, what the holiday haters will do, is they'll say, see, the pagans worshipped Ishtar or Eostre, which, by the way, none of that's true, but let's just say that it is. By painting eggs and worshiping rabbits or something like that. So for Christians to celebrate Jesus by painting eggs is them uh you know worshiping, serving their gods like the pagans did. So how would you argue that, Keith? Because that sounds pretty ironclad. Deuteronomy, bam.
Well, I was actually going to center in on, if you hadn't positioned it that way, I was going to center in on how to, where does it start? Do not inquire after their gods, saying, how do the nations serve their gods, that I may do likewise. To me, just reading that sentence alone is telling you, don't figure them out for the purpose of copying them. Right? Don't learn their ways so you can therefore repeat their ways, which would also include for the reason that they do it.
Mm-hmm. Unto their gods.
Unto their gods.
But he's more specific than that. But go ahead.
Yeah, and then he goes, you shall not behave thus toward your God. And then here's where I think this is important, is the counter to what you just said.
Mm-hmm.
For every abominable act which the Lord hates, they have done for their gods. I'm not sure that painting an egg is an abominable act.
It's an abominable act.
But then it gets even more specific.
Yes.
For, in other words, here's the example.
Yeah.
For they even burn their sons and their daughters in the fire to their gods. And if you know anything about the heart of God, you know that there's a sanctity to life, and he's all about love.
Yes.
And family as our perfect father. And the worst thing you could do would be to sacrifice a child to anything.
Definitely.
And that's an abominable act.
Yes. And look how he says, every abominable act which the Lord hates, they have done for their gods. So what he's saying is the way they served their gods in this region at that time. So we're talking about the Canaanites, a whole bunch of ites. Pretty much all the ites suck. So he basically is like, all these ites. No, you don't want to be an ite. Ites are no good, except for Israelites. Anyway, the rest of the ites are not good. So he basically saying all the ites, the way that they served their God was through child sacrifice, as well as bloodletting, and like these horrible orgies, these horrible things that are abominable to the Lord. So he's like, I don't want you to do that stuff. He's like, don't do it unto their gods. Don't ask how they went unto their gods. But here's the deal. They also sang songs to their gods. Is that abominable? Should we not? Because pagans sang songs to their gods, should we not sing songs to our God, Keith?
Well, nobody told David if that was the
No,
case.
no. Right. So in other words, if even if it were true, you have to ask yourself, what is the act itself?
Mm-hmm.
Is the act itself abominable to the Lord? In other words, is it sin? So is the act itself a sin? This is things we ought to avoid. Just because maybe they which they did, lit fires in the woods and danced around the fire while singing songs to their God. Does that mean we can't dance before the Lord because they dance before their gods? We can't do that now?
Well, if so, then you've just killed a lot of youth outings and camping trips.
Oh yeah, right. But you see what I'm getting at
yeah,
here? It's
absolutely.
like he's talking about abominable acts. He doesn't want them seeking anything that they did unto their gods, because what they did unto their gods was sick and gross and sinful and abominable before the Lord. He's not saying, well, they also sang, so you can't do that. They danced, so you can't do that. They raised their hands to their God, which they did. Does he mean you can't do that? No, he's talking about the abominable acts that they did unto their gods. You're to not do those.
Yeah, the one thing that I think might be important to look at and read from a sentence structure standpoint,
Mm-hmm.
and certainly I'm not reading this in Hebrew. I'm reading the English translation. What it does not say is, for every act they did was abominable.
Right.
Mm-hmm. What he's saying is that every abominable act which the
mm-hmm.
Lord hates, they have done for their God or gods.
Right.
So in other words, not everything they ever did in all of their lives was abominable.
Right. Exactly.
So don't do any of that. Don't breathe.
Mm-hmm.
Don't eat food.
Right.
Don't procreate. Yeah. Don't get married.
Right.
It doesn't say that.
They did sacrifice animals unto their gods as well. So are they not supposed to do that?
How are you going to reconcile that?
How are you have to throw away the entire sacrificial system that was established by the same writer of Deuteronomy?
Well, there you go.
So I think kind of right now what we're getting into is like, the question isn't like, can you do other behaviors that maybe pagans did that were not sinful?
Mm-hmm.
And we'll get into that more precisely, I think, because Paul actually addresses this pretty clearly, I think, on numerous occasions, both of which or a couple of which I put in here. But I think, do you have anything else along these lines before we kind of go on a little bit more?
No, go for it.
Okay, so I was telling Keith earlier, I haven't read these. Okay, so I had one of you guys wrote in, my buddy Ryan, I think I can use your name, and asked me, hey, can you please address this whole you can't celebrate Easter thing because it's pagan or whatever. And so I was like, yeah, I hadn't actually read or listened to these arguments in a long time. Like, I think the last time I did was like 10 years ago, because the only time I really go and revisit it, because I don't like to waste my time reading stupid things, is that I had a mom come in who, was like not going to come on Easter Sunday to the church because she had watched a thing online about how it was pagan, and I'm like, okay, I don't know, like, you come all the other Sundays, like, this is weird. So then that was the last time I really had to research and look it up and go, well, what are your reasons exactly? Of course, she sent me the video of this guy that said all the same. They always say all the same stuff. And I don't know, they're just quoting other people who said it, I guess. And just, by the way, and I want to be very bold about this, it is always the religious spirit. Always the religious spirit. It's like the religious spirit never wants you to have any fun, never wants you to celebrate anything ever, and wants you to stay in perpetual misery and lock yourself in a hole and do nothing but, like, read the Bible and sing hymns. Like, and this is all you can ever do. And you better be miserable doing it so God can test your character. I mean, this is the goal of the religious spirit. It doesn't care how dumb it is, or whether it makes any logical sense, or whether it has any historical validity whatsoever. We're going to make sure nobody does anything and call it holy. It just drives me crazy, Keith. It drives me absolutely crazy.
That's the sign. If somebody's smiling, that's the indicator that it might be wrong.
Yeah, like, it's just like, I'm so over it. Like, it's just, let's strip all joy out of everything until everyone's miserable and stoic and staring at the wall, and so we can just be whole. It's just crazy to me. I'm like, just stop with this. So anyways, sorry, that was my little rant. So anyway,
if you really think about that, by the way, if you really think that that's what holiness is, then you would also have to think that God is miserable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because there's nobody more holy than God. So if that's holiness, God must be absolutely miserable. A curmudgeon.
Yeah. Yes. And it's like somehow holiness gets equated with misery and pain. And I'm like, where is that? Like, I get that there's misery and pain in life. And I get that there are things that God asks us to do that might be difficult to do, that are not always fun, that are for our own good long term, but might hurt short term.
Mm-hmm.
Like, hey, don't have sex with your girlfriend. Wait until you're married. Well, that might be hard to do short term, but long term, there's more of a blessing there. Long term, that God's looking out for your best interest. So I get that there's things that can hurt in the short term or the long term. Maybe somebody gets called to lifelong celibacy. Like, that's a freaking nightmare. But some people are called to that. And I imagine that's got to be pretty dang difficult. In fact, the people I know who are doing it right now, in fact, my Greek teacher is a lifelong celibate from not her whole life. She had a divorce, and it felt like God called her to, and it's not easy for her, that intimacy and that close. That's very difficult. But all I'm saying is, like, so sometimes that can be the case, that when God calls us to a particular lifestyle, it might not always be easy. Or if we feel led to do a fast, fasts are not easy, this kind of a thing. But that's not this. The religious spirit just will look at every single thing to make another rule that you now have to follow, or another thing you can't do.
Yeah.
To make life as miserable as possible.
Well, it's like they want to make it. It's like they want to make God out to be the Meister burger. Do you remember that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's an amazing Christmas claymation action.
There you go. I mean, he just, they've got toys. Destroy the toys. There's joy happening. It's just terrible, and that's the way they want to make God and holiness out to be. So anyway.
Right, and it just drives me crazy. But anyway, so in my little journey, reminding myself of what the arguments actually were, for not celebrating Easter, I came across a video that I talked to Keith about earlier, and the title of it was literally this. I'll quote it: 5, quote, irrefutable reasons to not celebrate Easter, unquote. Okay, so I'm like, oh, apparently this guy has 5 irrefutable. I mean,
can't argue against that.
You cannot even argue against these. So I'm going to list them, and let's see maybe if we can, because we probably can do this pretty quickly. His number one argument is Easter is not found in the Bible. Bam! It's not found in the Bible, Keith. What does that mean? I guess you can't do anything that's not mentioned in the Bible specifically.
I guess not.
We better get rid of all children's ministries, all youth ministries. Those are not mentioned in the Bible.
Yeah, that's for sure.
What else? There's a whole bunch of things.
I don't recall potluck dinners being in.
Not like we would think of them, no.
Yeah, well, write that
Those
off.
are not mentioned. There's all kinds of stuff that isn't mentioned in the Bible. So what? Is there a specific command to celebrate? Here's a good question. We'll get to this in a second. Is there a command Now there are specific commands to celebrate certain feasts under the old covenant.
Yeah, like the Feast of
Is there a
Booths and things like that.
correct? Yeah, the seven feasts, Feast of Unleavened Bread, and so on. But are there commands to celebrate certain feasts, to celebrate certain things under the new covenant? Do we have any command under the new covenant that we have to celebrate something specifically?
I can't recall any.
No, there's none whatsoever. There's no command to celebrate anything. So it doesn't make it illegal to celebrate things. It makes it, there's no command to celebrate, and there's a reason for that. Now we have a command of the Lord: do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me, meaning taking communion.
Mm-hmm.
But that even that just means like when you eat, make a special effort, especially when you eat as a community, to remember my sacrifice on the cross. Okay, well, that's good. But this is not a command to celebrate anything. There really is no command to celebrate anything at all. So we'll get to that in a second. But the fact that Easter isn't in the Bible, neither is the 4th of July or Thanksgiving. Does this make this stuff like demonic? You know, to look at fireworks, to hang out with your family, eat some burgers or Keith meat in your case?
Neither are birthdays or anniversaries. And I'm here to tell you,
that's correct.
If you're married, you better celebrate the anniversary.
Yes. But that's not in the Bible either, Keith.
Mm.
And by the way, it's why Jehovah's Witnesses will not celebrate any holiday, including people's birthdays, because they're not in the Bible. Right? And to do so would be wrong. So, yeah. Again, it's like, okay, but it's because it's not there, we can't do it. I can't ride my bike, drive a car, work out with weights. I guess running is kind of there. If you want to talk about Paul, talking about I buff out my body to make it my slave, I guess that's sort of there. But, you know, running marathons. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff that is not in the Bible. It's just ridiculous to make a claim like that somehow because it's not in the Bible. You can't make an extra special recognition on a particular day.
So before we go on to number 2,
yeah,
like a part of me wants to have a ranking of the least joyful denomination up to the most like which one's the most miserable and which one's the least miserable.
Yeah, I would say Jehovah's Witness is right up there as one of the most miserable.
Wow.
Yeah, you can't celebrate anything. It's hyper religious. Again, this has been my own personal experience, and kids, many people I've counseled who have come out of Jehovah's Witness churches and to come into healing, you know. And I would say some of the best ones are like Mormons because they celebrate everything. You know, Mormons have a great time. Celebrate. They even celebrate Halloween. They have Halloween dances. I mean, Mormons go all the way. You know, they have lots of fun.
Oh man, that's an episode by itself. Halloween. But okay.
Yeah, that's probably a whole other episode. But do you have anything else before we move on to irrefutable reason number 2?
Let's go forward.
Okay, irrefutable reason number 2. Easter originated in paganism. Okay, so I think we've shown 1, it didn't. 2, even if it did, why is that relevant? You know, just because something was something then doesn't mean that's what it is now. Just because a word meant something, for instance, okay, 100 years ago, if I came up to you, Keith, or I would even say 60 years ago, 70 years ago, if I came up to you and I said, Keith, I am so gay, what would you think I was saying to you?
Happy.
100 years ago. Happy. Yeah, you'd be like, oh, that's awesome. I'm so glad you're so gay. I'm gay too. Right? So in other words, if we want to, let's remember the old Christmas carol.
Don we now
our gay apparel. What are we saying? Let's put on our happy clothes. You know, that's what we're saying. Let's put on our happy clothes. Now, just because that word meant that then doesn't mean it means that now. It's now taken on a whole other meaning. And so I can't use that word how I used it before because the meaning has changed. So just as within anything else, like just because a custom or a festival or whatever meant something at a certain time, it doesn't mean it means that now. So I can paint eggs and I can sing a song and I can have a meal unto the Lord, as I do everything unto the Lord, as we're going to find out that Paul actually says explicitly in a second. But
Well, here's how I would argue against this irrefutable claim, supposedly.
yeah,
Even though you could make a case about Job and the fact that covenant was in place, there was some sort of covenant relationship in place. I think you
right,
can probably make that case. And with chronologically where Job fits in biblically, that
right.
predates a lot of stuff. But you could also probably make the case of this: covenant itself was not introduced when God made covenant with Abraham.
Wow, that's an excellent point.
It was something that was prevalent in a pagan society. Yet it was the
That's true.
very thing that God did to start the path toward not only the covenant with Abraham, but eventually his offspring, Jesus, and with us. And what is very powerful and actually makes it possible for us
Yeah.
to be holy, be reconciled with God, to be all of these things, to be forgiven to begin with. It's what allows us and makes it possible for us to change because he's a covenant God.
Mm-hmm.
So that started
Wow.
in paganism.
Well, I think that's an excellent point, and you're totally right. Yeah, the idea of a covenant, of a blood covenant, of cutting covenant, those were all pagan ideas.
Mm-hmm.
They were not godly ideas. And God seemed to have taken them and done something crazy, which I don't think these people realize God can do. And it's called redemption. It's called taking something and redeeming it. In other words, take taking something that sucks and making it not suck anymore. you know, like I think about this. Like we used to talk about this in seminary all the time. Is that every culture, everywhere, from all time, had qualities that were godly
Mm-hmm.
and had qualities that needed to be redeemed, no matter what they are, as opposed to just obliterating them. And what we found, this is ironclad historically speaking, and I'm talking as a Native American now, that when the white man came, and instead of looking at the native cultures that they encountered and said, what's good here? What's holy here? What's beautiful here? Let's keep that and let's redeem that which can be redeemed. Instead of doing that, they just obliterated everything and tried to impose white culture on us, right? And that was to this day damaging. And I'm talking about my grandmother, my great grandmother, talking about the evils of the white man. You can't trust the white man, won't touch a $20 bill, because the pain caused by that obliteration and not understanding redemption. How different would it have been? How different all around the world would it have been if, when believers came in, they came in with what is beautiful and godly and what maybe needs to be redeemed, as opposed to just the sledgehammer AK-47 destroy everything approach.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I think you're right about it. I never looked at it that way.
And if you think about, again, like that's what God did. God came into the Jewish culture, right? He came in to a guy named Abraham, and he into a pagan society, and said, "What can I use? What needs to stop, and what can I redeem? Oh, covenant. I like that. I can redeem that.
Mm-hmm.
I can make that a beautiful thing, and I'm going to redeem it. I'm going to take it. And of course, there's things that we have to discard and destroy, like child sacrifice. I mean, it's great, fornication and adultery and things like that. Like those things need to go. But what's beautiful about a culture that we can take and and that's awesome. It's already, there were practices in my own tribe, in the Osage tribe, that were far more honoring towards women than were going on in the white culture at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Far more honoring. In fact, there's many instances where women were taken captive, and when the white man came to get them back, they refused to leave because they had way more freedom and were given way more authority and respect in my tribe than they were in the white culture.
Wow.
So what I'm saying is, what if we could have adopted those honoring and respecting women instead of treating them like property that my culture had in place at the time, instead of just destroy it all? And so I think that, again, even if this Easter originated in paganism, it's like, well, what was cool about that? That we can go, well, that was kind of beautiful. Why not use that? And you know what? We'll discard that because that's obviously sinful and not honoring to God.
Yeah.
Anyways, people don't tend to think like that. Okay. Number 3, irrefutable. Easter encourages lying because you tell people about the Easter bunny. So
Okay.
apparently Easter encourages people to lie and say there's an Easter bunny. I don't know that I even want to go there with this. I don't know that all lying is bad all the time. We'd have to go back to our discussion on lying on, on one of the 10 commandments and what does that word really mean? So I don't suppose we want to go into that right now, but, whether you want to foster a fantasy and a fun thing with your kids and call it lying or whatever or not, I think that's up to the parent to make that decision and decide how they want to navigate that world. But would you have thoughts on that?
I'm here to tell you that in most relationships, there are probably times where it's good not to tell the whole truth.
Yes.
And I'm talking about as a parent. Your kid can draw a picture, and that might not be the greatest picture. But what are you going to say? Yeah, that looks phenomenal. Right? There's a reason you do that. And it's out of love.
Right.
Which we've talked about before. So when it comes to the whole Easter bunny, just in this context of what this is trying to say, Easter bunny, Santa Claus, whatever it is.
Right.
The way that
same concept.
The way that I was brought up is very similar to the way that we've raised our kids. And that's, Easter bunny is about as real as you believe he is. Jesus is real no matter what you believe.
Right, exactly.
And yet, none of our kids have had any difficulty believing Jesus is real.
Right. Yeah.
So it's just, I don't think that it's scarring by any means.
Well, I can speak. Here's what I can speak to. I can speak as someone who's counseled, I don't know, thousands of young people over 27 years. And I will tell you this. Not one single kid who ever struggled with anything. I mean, struggled with their faith, struggled with their identity, struggled with their worth, struggled with their whatever, their relationships. Never one time ever in 27 years and thousands of not just kids, but adults too, ever came to me and said, my biggest issue was my parents told me there was an Easter bunny. And my life is effed up.
That's what screwed it up right there.
I never had anybody say that their parents telling them Santa Claus is real or the Easter somehow ruined their entire existence. In fact, I would say the opposite has been true. In other words, the people come to me said, I really appreciated that my parents let me dream and let me believe in Santa for as long as I did. Yeah. It was really fun. And I'm appreciative of that. That has been universally the response to me. So I don't know that Easter encourages lying any more than anything else, but I guess that's an irrefutable reason. Okay, so number four, the first century Christians didn't keep Easter. That was number 4. I'm like, okay, first of all, that's not true. Um, and maybe not in the way we would keep it now, but they did celebrate first fruits. That's absolutely true. And then began to associate it with the resurrection. We know that for sure. So that claim itself isn't even true, at least not the way he's trying to say it. But the secondary thing is, so what? So what? So I don't model my life after the first century Christians. I model my life after Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Like I think sometimes it's weird. Like right now, there's this whole movement even going on. This might be a little bit of a tangent, so maybe pull me back if it is. But there's
When
this
has
whole
that
move.
ever stopped us?
I know, right? There's this whole movement now that in order to have a New Testament church, we got to go back to the Book of Acts and do everything exactly how they did it. You know, and I sort of look at this and I go, I don't think this is such a good idea. You know, now when I look at the first century churches described in the Book of Acts, for instance, I think there's a lot of cool things we could learn from. I think there's a lot of awesome, but there's good and bad things. When you look at the letters that Paul wrote or Peter wrote or James or whoever, these were some jacked up people. I mean, I'm not sure we want to do what they were doing. I mean, the first century church was rife with racism and immorality and heresies of all kinds. Like, I'm not sure we want to go mimic this stuff. Like, I don't know if this is a good idea. Like, in my mind, the book of Acts was just the foundation. It's not telling us how to do church. The book of Acts is telling us how they did church and kind of like the good and the bad and the right and the wrong.
You mean
This is
it's
like a
not
baby.
didactic teaching?
No, no, it's not didactic teaching. It's just telling us how it was. So what we do is we look at that and we get inspired by it. We can learn from the principles, but we can also learn about stuff they did wrong. I mean, we're talking about the baby church. The reality is we should be way beyond the book of Acts. Should we not?
Yeah,
I mean, if this was the foundation stone.
you don't find that argument just odd for other reasons though? Like you don't like it's
What do you mean?
okay. So, and certainly we've both seen this. Um, hey, we need to be like the church in Acts, exactly like that first century
Right.
church in Acts. Does everybody agree? Yes, amen. We need to do that. Okay. Now, before we do
Yeah.
that, pull your phones out and scan this QR code to give your tithe and your offering. And
Yes.
then let's listen to an hour's worth of electrified worship music before we start being
Right.
the Acts church. Come on, man.
Right.
Are you kidding me?
Well, well, let's put it this way. If you're gonna be like the Acts church, first of all, you're going to have to figure out who the 12 apostles are. So you're going to have 12 apostles over your church, and every single person in your everyone without exception is going to have to sell every single thing they own, all their clothes, their cars, their houses, every single thing they own, and bring the proceeds from all of that and give it to 12 people who they need to then trust is going to somehow dole out all of this in a righteous way. Why aren't they doing that? They say they want to be an Acts 2 church or an Acts. We want to get back to the book of Acts. Well, then you better start with that because that's like the first thing they did. Why aren't they doing that, Keith? Why isn't that happening?
It's rather inconvenient.
Right. So they basically are doing what everybody does is they look at the book of Acts and they take the stuff that it seems relevant and good and say, well, those other things we either can't do or shouldn't do based on our cultural context, right?
Yeah.
Like it's not in our current cultural context, it isn't usually feasible to meet 6 hours a day with everybody because of where we live, our jobs, people, school. Our cultural context it doesn't work with that.
Yeah.
So in our cultural context, we need to figure out what community looks like, right? And then figure it out for us, as it's going to be different than it was for them. So it's just such a weird thing to me to look at this first baby church and say we want to be just like that. It's like I think we should be way beyond that. We should have way more maturity, way more love, way more of all of those things. And I'm not sure just by performing all the stuff they did, somehow we're going to magically have love and life in our church.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Well, yeah, because a part of it, and the reason for it in part is because it's just going through the motions.
Right.
There's no love behind it. It's just applying that formulaic approach to whatever it is we're talking about.
Right. So
So
now, because they
there's
did it this way,
no
so should
meaning to
we.
it. Sorry.
Right. Exactly. The things we can look at is go, they gave freely. That's a principle. So we as believers, giving freely and generously is a good thing, and we ought to do that and move in that. They spent some time together. We should spend time together. They listened to teaching that was good from the apostles. We should probably be reading and learning on our own, and also listening to teaching. They prayed. Well, we probably should do that too. I mean, those are all good things that we should all do. But anyway, when you're talking like early Christians didn't keep Easter, the early Christians also in Corinth thought that it was great that this guy was sleeping with his dad's wife. So First Corinthians 5 or Second Corinthians 5, I forget what it is. Paul has to rebuke them and go, you guys, not even the pagans are in this kind of immorality. This isn't love. Kick this guy out. I mean, so this is how immature they were. You know what I'm saying? That's why Paul in 1 Corinthians 14, he has to go on and on about how the gift of healing came from one God, and the gift of such and such is one Lord, and the gift of discernment is from one God. Well, he's doing that because the Corinthians thought they're all coming from different gods. So Paul, they had the right experience and horrible theology, and Paul had to come along and go, guys, it's the same God. It's not a different God. I don't know. We want to go back to this kind of immaturity, that we see in the early church. But anyway, so just because they did or didn't keep it is completely irrelevant to us. Anyways,
here's how I know that there's not a Greek equivalent or a Koine Greek equivalent to dude. Because if there was, you'd see it all over the Pauline letters, where he'd just be like,
that's true,
dude. And then make his point. Are you crazy? Come on,
Well, he does say that kind of thing. You foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? How dumb are you guys? He uses that kind of phrasing a lot.
Yeah. But I know there's not a 1-for-1 correlation to the word dude, or it'd be all over Paul.
Yeah, it's totally true. You're right. So the last irrefutable reason not to celebrate Easter is that Jesus wasn't resurrected on Sunday morning. Which, again, I think we've already shown isn't the case. And even if he was on Saturday, like the Seventh-day Adventists say, so what? What relevance does this have to anything? You know what I mean? So, anyway, go ahead.
Well, now the only thing so far that comes to mind is The Princess Bride. And I know you've seen that movie.
If you haven't, then you probably don't know Jesus.
Yes, you are unsaved.
Yes.
So, the point where he says, I don't think that word means what you think it means.
Yeah. I don't think that word means what you think it means. Yeah.
That is the word irrefutable in this person's 5 irrefutable reasons.
Yes. Not only are those reasons very refutable, some of his reasons aren't even true, much less irrefutable. So it's just utter nonsense. So, do you want to go unless you want to segue some other way, but
no.
I just thought we'd go to what does the Bible actually say about these kinds of topics and kinds of issues? Because they are addressed by Paul specifically.
Let's look at first-hand accounts.
That'd be great.
Primary sources. Let's look at primary sources.
Okay. Paul has all of Paul's letters are primary sources, of course. So in case everyone does not know, in Romans 14. So if you want to go to Romans 14, and we could actually start Romans 14:1 if you want to. Okay. There was an issue both in the church in Rome, in the church in Corinth, and probably a lot of other churches as well, where what was happening was there was this whole issue that the church was dividing over, which once again, this is what these people do: is they cause division needlessly. But the church was dividing over an issue of eating meat sacrificed to idols, right? This was like a big deal. So what was happening was they would take a cow or sheep or whatever, and they would sacrifice it unto Artemis, let's say, who was a Ephesian goddess, right? Ephesian goddess. So they would do that, and they would kill it. And of course, you don't want to throw away the meat, so they would take the meat and they would sell it on the market, sometimes right in front of the temple of Artemis, sometimes somewhere else. But they would sell it, and then the proceeds would go back to the temple sometimes, or they would go to whoever the merchant was that purchased it from the temple. Okay, does it make sense so far?
Mm-hmm.
So what was happening was there was mature Christians in Rome, and there were immature Christians in Rome. In other words, there were Christians who had been Christians for a while in Rome, and there was Christians who had just come to know Christ. And the ones who had come to know Christ were a bit more immature in their faith. They didn't fully understand the gospel. And they were thinking, oh, crap, if we eat this meat sacrificed to idols, we're going to be tainted. We're going to be demonized. We're in some way compromised because we just ate this meat that has spiritual cooties. Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's literally what they were
analogy.
thinking.
That's wonderful.
Yes,
Spiritual
and
cooties.
so yeah, they thought it had spiritual cooties, so we can't eat it. And then the mature believers were like, "You guys are stupid. Like this is just meat. Like this, there's no power here. Just because it was sacrificed to an idol, it's still just the same as the meat that you killed on your farm. Like there's no cooties on it. Just because whatever purpose that it was sacrificed for is irrelevant to the fact that it's still meat. It doesn't have spiritual cooties. Like get over it. That was the issue." Okay, so that issue was dividing the church in Rome. It was also dividing the church in Corinth, and it may have been dividing other churches. We just don't hear about it from Paul specifically. But that is the context of Romans 14. So he says this, Romans 14:1. Now, accept the one who is weak in faith. Now, the people who can you hear me still?
Yeah.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah. It got a little funky there for a second.
There we go. I think because I bumped this thing.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Anyways, he's equating one's weak in faith as those who will not eat meat and only eat the vegetables, because they don't have the faith yet to understand that the meat doesn't have cooties. So Paul calls those weak in faith those who won't eat the meat because they think it has cooties, because the deeper people in faith, the stronger faith, understand that it's just meat, and there's nothing. What's the word I'm looking for? When somebody's overly supernatural, what's the word I'm looking for? Like we would say somebody's like
on every
paranoid.
Corner. I'm just kidding.
Well, what's that?
On every corner, but I'm thinking here because everybody's over spiritual.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, yeah. But I mean, somebody that's paranoid in their focus on the supernatural, we would call superstitious.
Okay.
I can't come up with
I didn't know where you're going.
So he's saying these people are like almost like they're superstitious, so they're kind of weak in their faith. Where those of you who are stronger in your faith, you realize that you can eat meat and it's no big deal. Mm-hmm. So that's what he means by that. Except the one who is weak in faith, but not for the purpose of passing judgment on his opinions. In other words, like, don't judge him and mock him and make him feel bad, right? He says, one person has faith that he may eat all things. Okay? So one person is like, this is whatever. But he who is weak eats vegetables only. Do you see? Which I know you know is true, Keith.
That's highlighted in mine.
Right. So, of course, what Paul's talking about is those who are weak in faith don't have the faith to know that they can eat everything.
Yeah.
They're still superstitious. They're still religious. They don't understand the full power of the gospel. So they're still freaking out over trivial things like what we should eat. That's literally what Paul's saying.
Yeah. But going back to the first verse, that doesn't make him a bad person.
No, no, not at all.
They don't have the ill intent, malintent with that.
Mm-mm.
They're trying to do the right
No,
thing. They just don't get it.
correct.
They're just
Exactly,
ignorant.
exactly. Which I think honestly is probably most of the people who would believe these things.
Mm-hmm.
They're trying to do the right thing. They want to serve God. They just haven't yet had the revelation of the freedom of Christ, which is the same thing Paul's addressing here, just a different context.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the same issue he's addressing. It's just manifesting in a different way in the church in Rome. So he says the one who eats, or remember the one who has faith and eats anything he wants to, is not to regard with contempt the one who does not eat. So don't look down on them. Don't make fun of them like I just kind of did earlier. Like, he's really saying we shouldn't do that. Now, of course, I wouldn't do that to somebody's face. I would be kind and loving and all of that. But some ideas deserve mockery. Anyways, so he says, um, and the one who does not eat is not to judge the one who eats. Right? So he's saying the one who thinks it has spiritual cooties shouldn't look down on and judge the one who can eat meat, like as being like, compromised or something like that. He says, for God has accepted him. Then, of course, verse 4, who are you to judge the servant of another? To his own master he stands or falls, and he will stand, for the Lord is able to make him stand. So, in other words, his point so far is simply that it's between you and God. It's between that person and the Lord. So I've said this many, many, many times. Like the guy that had the 5 reasons of not celebrating Easter, blah, blah, blah,
Mm-hmm.
blah. I'm totally fine if he wants to make that choice for himself and his family.
Yeah.
That's fine. That's his personal choice to make.
And if truly he felt that way, if truly he felt it was a
Right.
sin, then for him it would be a sin.
For him, it would be a sin. That's exactly right. But what I take issue with, and why I get angry and irritated and will come back, is when now you're saying no one can, right? Because now you're judging exactly what Paul says you shouldn't do.
Mm-hmm.
So as soon as you say, because I'm not sitting here saying everyone has to celebrate Easter. I don't care what you do. I don't care if you celebrate Easter or don't, or how you celebrate Easter or you won't. I can't based on what Paul is telling me to do here.
Yeah.
But as soon as I say everyone now has to do this X and such in regards to this eating meat or holidays or whatever, like I've now stepped out of love and I've stepped into judgment and control on either side of the coin. And that's what Paul's saying here. So hopefully that's making sense.
Yeah, and we see that quite a bit. To me, it's almost funny that you not only see that from a spiritual perspective in what we're talking about here, but you almost see this from an actual vegan versus carnivore perspective now. Anyway,
yeah,
where people
true.
are out and out militant about it. I don't eat meat. Nobody needs to eat meat.
Right.
Okay. Well, don't eat meat. That's cool.
Right. Yeah, and I'm like, dude, if you don't want to eat meat, don't eat meat.
More bacon.
And if you
for me?
felt that, yeah, right, exactly. If you felt personally like God has told you not to eat something or not to do something, you ought not do it.
Mm-hmm.
But as soon as you tell everyone else they can't, now you're stepping out of love and into judgment and control, which is the very thing that Paul is forbidding here. And he's saying, look, you're to stand before your own master. And that's why he says, for the Lord is able to make him stand. What he means is when your heart is right before the Lord, based on what you feel like he's told you to do, then it becomes right before the Lord. But as soon as you say, right, everyone, or no, like, we're not, again, I don't care who celebrates Easter or not, or who cares? Like this, like it doesn't make any difference to me, and it shouldn't. But as soon as I say no one can celebrate Easter because it's pagan, now I've done exactly what Paul says we should do.
Now, I do think it's probably important that we make a distinction here, or make certain that we clarify something. This would not override moral imperatives.
No, absolutely not.
Like you wouldn't say, well, if you think it's cool to kill people, then God makes it okay. You think it's
No,
okay to cheat on your spouse all over the place? Then God's cool with it. That is not remotely what is either being said
no,
here or how we're positioning it.
no, that's not what Paul would say. That's not what we're saying. There are universal moral absolutes
Mm-hmm.
that are clearly, we've already gone over these, right? With previous podcasts,
Mm-hmm.
we've gone over what those moral absolutes are. They're reiterated in the New Testament. So I can say fornication is wrong for all people in all time. That is a universal moral absolute. As I would say, murder, as I would say, lying, as we've defined lying,
Mm-hmm.
um, as adultery, fornication, um, theft, coveting, these kinds of things. These are all universal moral absolutes that I can say that's wrong for me and that's wrong for you.
Mm-hmm.
Like I can say that because God makes them universal moral absolutes. Paul is grabbing an issue that is not a universal moral absolute, does not have any moral weight to it, and is simply saying, let people do what they want to do or not do what they don't want to do,
Mm-hmm.
and don't judge them for it. But he does actually intimate later, this is not in this one, but in the next passage, he talks about once, if you have an opportunity to bring your brother into deeper faith so he knows eating meat is fine, then take that opportunity. So he's not saying don't teach and don't enlighten and don't bring into maturity either. He's just simply saying don't judge and get weird about it.
Well, there's a prioritization there. Love trumps everything.
Correct.
But at the same time, don't make non-issues issues.
Exactly. It's exactly what he's saying because it's all about love. So love wouldn't allow, I would not allow you to continue in sin if
Yeah.
I saw it. I would, if I love you, I would call you out. I would hope you do the same for me.
Yeah.
If I was walking in sin in some way, I would expect you in love to tell me, dude, you're wrong, and you need to repent. you're not going the right way. But I would also, in love, if you're doing something that I feel like is not deep into the maturity, but you really feel passionate about, I probably just hang back and go, all right, man, that's what you want to do. Like, that'd be okay. Because look what he says. He actually specifically addresses the issue of Christmas, and he specifically addresses the issue of Easter on the very next phrase. One person regards one day above another. Another regards every day alike. So what is he saying? Some people celebrate or focus on in a unique way on a particular day. Other people don't celebrate and don't focus in a particular way on a particular day. Look at the next verse or next phrase. Each person must be fully convinced in his own mind. So, in other words, if you want to celebrate a certain day like Easter, go ahead. And if you don't. Just be fully convinced in your own mind. Like, if you look at the next verse, he who observes the day, observes Easter, observes Christmas, observes anniversary, observes birthday, observes whatever,
Mm-hmm.
observes it for the Lord. And he who eats does so for the Lord, for he gives thanks to God. And he who eats not, for the Lord he does not eat, and give thanks to God. So see, his point is simply that we all love Jesus, we're all following Jesus. Everything we do is because we love Jesus. That's
Yeah.
what he's saying. Whether we celebrate it or don't celebrate it, it's because we love Jesus.
And because of that, you can redeem a lot of things.
Yes, it's exactly right. Many things can be redeemed. Some things need to be discarded, but many things can simply be redeemed.
Yeah.
If you want to celebrate, he goes on, he makes this point like, for not one of us lives for himself, and not one dies for himself. For if we live for the Lord. If we die for the Lord. Therefore, whether we live or die, we are the Lord.
Yeah.
So his whole point is like, look, man, we love Jesus. Everything we do is for Jesus. We're doing it because we love him. You celebrate, your anniversary with your wife. because you love Jesus.
Yeah.
You understand what I mean? Like in part, right? I mean, obviously you love your wife, but in part, I want to celebrate my wife because I love Jesus. Why? Because it's part of my giving thanks to the Lord.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome.
So if I celebrate birthdays of my kids, I do it unto the Lord. Why? Because I'm thanking the Lord that I have a kid to celebrate, and for my beautiful son or daughter.
That's what makes it a joyous occasion.
Exactly.
Thus the joy in kingdom.
Exactly.
So let me ask you a question about that second half of verse 5. Each
Yeah.
person must be fully convinced in his own mind. Is that working out your own salvation?
Yes. I think that's a large part of it right there. In other words, it's like, what is the Lord telling you? What is your relationship with the Lord? What does it look like for you to follow him? Being fully convinced in your own mind. Again, not contrary to the scriptures,
Mm-hmm.
not contrary to the revelation of the Father's heart. In other words, we know who God is, not contrary to that. Beyond that, it's your relationship with the Lord to live how you are to live in your own relationship with him, whatever that looks like.
Yeah. All right.
I mean, sometimes I think of it like this, like, you have people that are involved in missions and they're evangelists and they do all these missions all over the world. And oftentimes, and this isn't always true, but oftentimes they'll come to churches and it's a lot of shame and guilt about how you all need to be out there on mission trips, right? You all need to get out and share the gospel. They need to do this and that. Well, is that really true? And what about when Paul says, actually have an ambition to live a quiet life and to work with your hands? You see what I mean? It's like, well, maybe you're called as a teacher to never leave that town. You know what I'm saying? Maybe that's how you're working your salvation out.
Yeah.
And yours is working out to go to Russia or Egypt or wherever. Well, praise God. But don't judge another, just like Paul says.
That's a great point. To me, anytime I encounter somebody with that mindset and that approach, it's always I call it an over there approach.
Mm-hmm.
You're always supposed to go over there.
Over
Insert
there. Yeah.
whatever country that's not the
Right.
United States in over there.
Right.
And that's where you're
Right.
supposed to go. I'm going on a mission. And it's not bad that somebody wants to go to, insert country here, Honduras or
Right.
South Africa or, whatever.
Right.
But a lot of stuff to do here too. And here meaning
Right.
your city, your neighborhood.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
there's a lot of people to be reached no matter where you are. So
Yeah.
it just
What about
always
your
kind of
uncle?
seemed yeah.
Your mom, your dad? I mean, how about your own family coming to Christ? I mean, my goodness, my wife and I are working on her family and have been. And since we got back, it's notched up because we feel a call to win her family to the Lord, for crying out loud. And that's one of our main focuses right now, as far as our evangelistic focus is, like, we want her family to come to Christ, and not that none of her family is, but a large part of her family isn't. So,
well, I'll just give you a side piece of advice. Eat meat on Easter. It will help.
I think that it would. I really do. And by the way, so when we talk about bunnies and hares, again, that probably came from bringing it to America. 1700s or so is when we really actually see this being a thing. It's not a carryover from the fertility god Ishtar or any of that nonsense. This is something that the Germans did, because Germans did all kinds of weird things. So they brought that over, and probably in Mesopotamia a long time ago, we see people begin to paint eggs red for the blood of Jesus. And at the end of Lent, it was tradition to eat a hard-boiled egg.
Why?
As the first thing you ate, because they were common. It was poor people could get a hold of them, and they stayed longer when you hard-boiled them, right? And so became a common thing for people to paint their eggs red to represent the blood of Jesus, and then to eat them at the end of Lent to break the fast. So that became very common at the time. Um, and then later on, the Easter or eggs themselves began to be associated with the Trinity because you have the shell, the white, and the yolk. And they began to talk to children about it like that. So this is where those things came from. Like this is why they began to be used at the time, not because they were pagan in origin. But again, even if they were, it's irrelevant. Let's just say they all were. They're now redeemed. You see what I mean?
Yeah,
I think we can
absolutely.
redeem an egg.
Yeah.
There's nothing evil about an egg. There's nothing evil about a bunny. You can redeem these things, right? They're not like you can't redeem child sacrifice. I mean, you can't redeem fornication. Like this is stuff that has to stop, right? This is stuff that you never want anything to do with. But an egg, like I think you can redeem an egg, and like the question is right.
Yeah, well, Waffle House does it every day. They're redeeming those eggs daily. So,
Exactly.
you know, it's interesting as we get closer to wrapping up this episode. There was a there was a time frame. So for Alice and I, we grew up and none of this was an issue. Like
Right.
Christmas certainly wasn't an issue. Easter wasn't an issue.
Right.
Halloween wasn't an issue
Right. Because
because
there's no internet.
yeah,
That's why.
yeah. I mean, where we grew up, it didn't. I mean, really, it didn't matter. And besides,
Right.
it even for the people that seem to be making the case, and yeah, I'm going to flip it to Halloween just for a moment. That trick or treating is going to send you to hell. So come to the church and just take the candy out of our trunk of our car.
Right.
And now suddenly it's holy.
Now it's okay.
And
Well,
it,
even a lot of places would argue that's evil too. But anyway.
and you allow your kids to dress up as superheroes and princesses every day, just not that one evening.
Not
That's
on that day.
suddenly terrible.
Yeah. Right.
So it's just like, come on. But for us, that wasn't ever an issue until we got to this area of the country. And I don't know what it is and what's going on, but there's a lot of people that do hold Halloween to be terrible, or even
Mm-hmm.
Easter. So
Right.
we certainly never saw that as being terrible. We were told forever Easter is the Super Bowl Sunday of
Right.
Christianity. It's
Right.
the day.
Mm-hmm.
As a matter of fact, if you're going to celebrate anything, celebrate Easter over Christmas, right?
Yeah.
And then we
Right.
get
Right.
we get to this area, and that's the first time that we encountered anybody who would make you feel wrong about any part of Easter, including the bunnies, including
Right.
the eggs, including all of that. So much so that you start to kind of be influenced by that. So there was one year,
Right.
and I don't think Alice would mind me sharing this. There was one year where that just kind of started. Well, hold on a minute. Maybe we need to kind of rethink this for a second, or maybe at least we need, like, we don't think that it's wrong, but maybe we need to make sure that the focus is put in the right area. That's kind of when
Right.
you start to over spiritualize and you're like,
Right.
I
Right.
want to make sure that the
Right.
kids know this is
Yeah.
about Jesus, which,
Right. Right.
isn't bad, but you see where I'm going.
Sure. Oh yeah.
And it was so much so that there were no eggs that year, no baskets. My
Right.
kids were crushed.
Really.
Jack was
Yeah.
crushed, man. It's like,
Yeah.
what's this about? You
Yeah.
know?
Oh yeah.
And it just, and it's not like he suddenly started believing in Jesus more. It became, it broke his heart.
Yeah.
And we were like, hold on, something's missing with this. Like
Right.
something's
Right.
off. So even when you don't know, perhaps you can't necessarily put it in words. Your spirit knows that
Yes.
you're making a mountain out of a molehill.
Yes.
You're making a non-issue an issue.
Well, what happened to us, Keith, is the same thing happened to you when we were in that same region.
Really?
Not to the we didn't actually act on it, but it was the pressure we felt that my wife and I ended up having a conversation about it. We didn't do anything differently, but we had a conversation. Where and I realized it's the pressure of the community you're in.
Hmm.
And when you're in a community that has the people you love, people you respect, people that love Jesus, and all of them around you are telling you, Easter's evil or the eggs are evil and blah, 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 blah. It's the pressure of it makes you go, gosh, am I missing something? Like, is this evil and I'm just deceived, or something like that.
Because again, they don't have malintent. They're not trying.
No,
Yeah.
exactly. They're trying to love Jesus, right?
Yeah.
The ones I knew are trying to be holy and they're trying to love Jesus and follow Jesus with everything they are. And hey, if this is compromise, then I guess I better not do it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's almost like going backwards, because Paul calls that being weak in faith, which is interesting because they would think they were stronger in faith. How ironic is that?
Yeah.
So I always thought that was so ironic that the ones that think they're the most deep in faith, Paul would actually say are weaker because they haven't had the full revelation of the Father's love and the freedom that then comes with that. So that was always interesting to me. But I always would think of it this way, like, what's evil about putting a basket in front of your kids' door with some goodies in it? Is that evil? Is that wrong? Is that morally bad?
It would seem no.
No. What about painting an egg? Is something evil about picking up a egg and coloring it? I mean, is this an evil act, an abomination unto the Lord?
Well, let's see. I'm not sacrificing my kids while doing it.
Yeah.
I'm not. I'm not doing any sort of evil incantations during the moment. So I would say no.
And can some things just be fun for the sake of being fun? Or do we have to say Jesus every 5 seconds? Like, I've said this to people before too. How many times does a song have to say Jesus or God before it's a worship song?
At least once every chorus.
Okay, well, there you go. But you understand, my point is this. There's no such thing as a worship song. There's such things as worshipers. So it's a heart condition. And if you're worshiping God, you can worship God to any song. Now, obviously, things are vile and degrading and things that we wouldn't want to.
But your spirit's going to know it.
But right, exactly. Your spirit's going to know. But I mean, how many times, now be honest with me, Keith, have you worshiped God to a quote unquote secular song?
Every single day. And that is no exaggeration. Every day.
Just today. It was literally a beautiful day today. It was like 80 degrees here in Castle Rock, which is amazing. And I'm going to pick up two of my sons from school. Have all the windows down. And the car, I just turned the car on, right? So the radio was on, which I don't usually listen to the radio anyway. But it comes on, and it's U2. Beautiful day. It's a beautiful day. Bam, bam. And I leave it on. I crank it up. I'm driving, and I am full on worship mode. I'm hands in the air. I'm praising God for this beautiful day. That was a worship song then for me in that moment.
Yeah.
I was worshiping him with all my heart. I was like, thank you, Lord. It's a beautiful day. I mean, I was just so excited, to have this privilege of this beautiful day in this car. And it was great.
Yeah.
So anyway, I guess or maybe not the last thing, or if you have something else, but I was just going to read to kind of cap this off, 1 Corinthians 10:23 and following. It's kind of Paul's final thought on this kind of stuff. And he says, all things, this is 1 Corinthians 10:23, all things are lawful, but not all things are profitable. Then he repeats it. All things are lawful, but not all things edify. So what is his point here? He's saying, look, he doesn't mean all things are lawful in the sense like fornication would be lawful or something like that, obviously. But he basically means Everything that's not that, you can do. But it doesn't make it a good idea necessarily. Yeah. And then the second thing, you can do whatever you want, but not everything's going to edify everyone. And then that's why the next verse he goes, let no one seek his own good but that of his neighbor. Well, what is that? That's the law of love. So he's simply saying, like, whatever you do, make sure it's done in love and that it's loving. Then, of course, he's going back to the idol thing. Eat anything that is sold in the meat market without asking questions for conscience sake. So, look, those people have a problem with it. Just eat it and don't ask where it came from so that you don't feel defiled. I mean, that's literally what he's saying, which how hilarious is that?
Yeah, Paul is essentially telling you don't look at the rating on the door.
Yes.
Look
at verse 27. He says the same thing. If one of the unbelievers invites you and you want to go, eat anything that's set before you without asking questions. So, look, man, if somebody might just eat what they put in front of you. Don't ask where it came from. So you won't have to have this weird struggle if you're weak in faith, is basically what he's saying. So, it's just funny when you look at how much Paul does not give a crap about this kind of stuff. And he specifically tells you, like, do whatever you want to do in the Lord as your own personal conscience before the Lord. Whether you're celebrating something or eating meat or not eating meat or whatever the issue is, do it unto the Lord.
I love it because, I mean, he's back to where you started with 23. Hey, you can do it. Just because you can do it doesn't mean you should do it.
Yeah, that's exactly what he's saying.
But, hey, if you do it, don't make it a thing.
Yeah. And just make sure it's loving and you're not hurting your neighbor by doing it. So, I don't know. Like, for instance, I used to counsel Vietnam veterans, like, on a regular basis.
Okay.
I don't know if God just anointed me. I think I was anointed for it for a season because I had tremendous success with veterans who were in their 60s. Some of them had been having PTSD for like 30 years and it was gone. Like, it was the Father's love just healed them. So I don't know what it was. It was just a unique time where I saw God do a lot of healings in the Vietnam vets, which was so satisfying to me, or gratifying to me to be like, wow, this is amazing. Well, I have one Vietnam veteran who came in, and he's a good friend of mine, and his name is Thumper. And he was called that because he's like 6'4", biker, tatted everywhere, very tough individual, heroin dealer in Vietnam. Anyways, because of that experience, any really loud noises like a gunshot or something like that, he still really has a hard time with that, right? If he's my neighbor, I might have the freedom to go out and launch a bunch of fireworks and blow up a bunch of stuff. But you know what? I'm not going to do that because my friend Thumper, who I love, can really be wounded by that. And so I'm going to respect him. And if I want to let those off, I'm going to go down to the elementary school, 6 blocks away, where he can't be affected by that. Does that make sense? That's the kind of thing I'm thinking
Absolutely.
of. Like,
yeah.
I can do that, but it's not loving for me to do that here because I love Thumper.
Mm-hmm.
And that would really wound him, So that's the kind of thing.
So to bring us full circle, if you're going to celebrate Easter and you know somebody who thinks that that's just wrong, don't invite them to the egg hunt.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
It's that simple.
Yes. If they think it's wrong, don't invite them to color eggs with you. Just don't. Don't talk to them about it and don't invite them. Just leave them alone. Let them do what they're going to do.
And love them anyway.
And love them anyway. That's right. The worst thing we could do is what these people on the internet do. And that's to shame and to guilt and to imprison and to judge others who are exercising their freedom in Christ. Yeah. And that goes on both sides of the table.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, there it is. I don't know. Man, maybe we should call this the irrefutable reason that you can celebrate Easter.
The 14 irrefutable reasons why you can celebrate Easter if you want to. I just love Paul. Do you not love Paul's like how Paul is so radically crazy about certain issues that he'll be like, chop your penises off, you horrible Judaizers. Like the stuff he's passionate about. And then the other things that don't have to do with the simple gospel, he is so laid back about. You know what I mean? He's so like, whatever. You regard that day above another. Like, so what? Like, do what you want to do. All things are lawful. I don't care. Isn't that interesting? He's so laid back about certain things and then so forceful about things like the gospel.
But if you really think about it, that's a great indicator of what's actually important. Mm-hmm. Because he understood it. He totally got it. So if he starts getting upset about something, you have to go, hold on a minute, that set him off. Mm-hmm. Why?
This is a big deal.
That's the issue, not this other nonsense.
Yes. And if you want to look at the issues Paul really was upset about, it was people adding things to the gospel, like performing to be holy. And then secondarily, abject, heinous sin. Mm-hmm. Fornication, adultery, things like that. Like those are the things he was really passionate about. Like, don't sin and don't tell people they have to do stuff to be holy. And everything else, he's like, whatever. Like, do whatever you want to do,
I have a total image in my head suddenly of Paul sharpening a knife, a circumcision knife, while eating an Easter egg. He's like, priorities,
Yeah. And then Timothy comes in and goes, that's not a knife. This is a knife.
I don't know how we're going to top that. We might as well end on that one. Right? Well, if anybody would like to get in touch with us, ask questions, recommend topics to cover, or just say, you know what? I honestly at least want to give to one of these guys, then you can do so by
go to unleashministries.net and you can click on Ask Me if you have any questions or want to throw in a topic or two, well, many of you have, so thank you for that.
And you can go to rocksaltcoaching.com, contact us, or you could certainly always go to the Facebook page, or like most people do when you want to talk, just send me a text. And if you don't have my text number, sorry. Not handing it out here. So, all right, everybody. We certainly love you, and we'll catch you next episode.